Bonjour à tous, nous nous retrouvons sur Dagon HP Lovecraft. J'avais dit un stream sur quoi dire, Star Ocean, mais j'ai décidé de faire sur Lovecraft Dagon. Bon, je regarde un peu là pour le son. Parce que il est comment dire ça, un peu trop fort sur le live que j'ai fait juste avant, et ce n'était pas bon. Bah ouais, je vous propose de commencer. Et développeur et éditeur par Bit et Golem, le jeu, un petit Lovecraft.
I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more.
Maître Céline dans un état de tension mentale considérable, car ce soir je ne serai plus. D'accord. Aujourd'hui, je vais vous rencontrer des éléments interactifs permettant de poursuivre votre voyage au cours. Non, d'autres vous relèveront. Faites intéressant sur le récit original. C'est un son auteur. D'accord. D'accord.
Penniless, and at the end of my supply of the drug which alone makes life endurable, I can bear the torture no longer, and shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid street below. Do not think from my slavery to morphine that I am a weakling or a degenerate.
Bah, un peu si.
When you have read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realize, why it is that I must have forgetfulness or death.
Bon, le jeu est gratuit si vous avez envie d'y jouer.
I was supercargo, fell a victim to the German sea raider. Bon bah, des menaces c'est pas mal. The Great War was then at its very beginning, and the ocean forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their later degradation. So that our vessel was made a legitimate prize, whilst we of her crew were treated with all the fairness and consideration due us as naval prisoners.
Bon, il y aura beaucoup de textes, hein. C'est un Lovecraft. La musique d'ambiance est assez intéressante. Ah, il s'enfuit par
So
bateau.
liberal, indeed, was the discipline of our captors that 5 days after we were taken, I managed to escape alone in a small boat with water and provisions for a good length of time.
D'accord, tout seul vraiment le mec. Hein. Le mec c'est je me tire tout seul pour ma peau. C'est vrai que sur un petit bateau, en plus c'est pas
When I finally found myself adrift and free, I had but little idea of my surroundings. Never a competent navigator, I could only guess vaguely by the sun and stars that I was somewhat south of the longitude. I knew nothing, and
T'as rien trouvé là? Peut-être des étoiles? Non. Il n'y a rien du tout. Hop. Ah, c'est dommage.
the weather kept fair, and for uncounted days I drifted aimlessly beneath the scorching sun, waiting either for some passing ship or to be cast on the shores of some habitable.
Call of Cthulhu. Un très bon jeu, pour ceux qui connaissent pas. Je le conseille si vous aimez bien les jeux genre polar effrayants avec des mythes, genre le Lovecraft, ou jeux pas dans le genre Resident Evil puisque c'est du FPS, mais dans le genre ah zut, je me rappelle plus les. Il y avait des jeux
But
comme
neither ship nor
Call
land
of
appeared,
Cthulhu, mais je me
and
rappelle
I
pas là.
began to despair in my solitude upon the heaving vastness of unbroken blue. The change happened whilst its details I shall never, for my slumber, though troubled and dream-infested.
Ah, une pieuvre.
When at last I awoke, it was to
Quelle
discover
moche.
myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire, which extended about me in monotonous undulations as far as I could, and in which my boat, though one might well imagine that my first sensation would be of wonder at so prodigious and unexpected a transformation, for there was in the air. The region was putrid with the carcasses of decaying fish and of other less describable things which perhaps I should not hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell. There was nothing within hearing and nothing in sight save a vast reach of black slime, yet the very completeness The sun was blazing down from a sky which seemed to me almost black in its cloudless.
Et que des pieuvres à foison. C'est dégoûtant, hein.
As I crawled into the stranded boat, I realized that only one. Through some unprecedented volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor must have been thrown to the surface, exposing regions for which innumerable millions of years had lain hidden. So great was the extent of the new land which had risen beneath me that I could not detect the faintest noise of the surge. Nor were there any seafowl to prey upon the dead things.
Poisson, pas un petit truc ah là. Très intéressant. Si vous découvrez une petite île volcanique, et vous pourrez la revendiquer.
For several hours I sat thinking or brooding in the boat, which lay upon its side and afforded a slight shade as the sun moved across the heavens. As the day progressed, the ground lost some of its stickiness and seemed likely to drop. That night I slept but little, and the next day I made for myself a pack containing food and water, preparatory to an overland journey in search of the vanished sea and
Y a rien à trouver. Hein.
On the third morning, I found the soil dry enough to walk upon with ease. The odor of the fish was maddening, but I was too much concerned with graver things to mind so slight an evil, and set out boldly for.
Rien du tout. On continue.
All day I forged steadily westward, guided by a faraway hummock which rose higher than any other elevation on.
Ça, c'est pas une pieuvre, hein. 3-4 crochets, en plus avec un dard au milieu. Je ne sais pas ce que c'est, mais c'est... Ça n'a pas l'air d'être aquatique, hein. Ça fait presque penser à un extraterrestre. Ok, maintenant c'est des pics là. Il y a une baleine et puis il y a des pics comme des trucs d'araignée là. Petites papates. Plutôt dégoûtant.
That night I encamped, and on the following day still travelled toward the hummock, though that object seemed scarcely nearer than when I had first espied it.
les extraterrestres sont là, ils sont parmi nous, sous forme de poissons.
By the fourth evening, I attained the base of the mound, which turned out to be much higher than an intervening valley setting it out in sharper relief. Too weary to ascend, I slept in the shadow. I know not why my dreams were so wild that night, but ere the waning and fantastically gibbous moon had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in a cold perspiration, determined. Such visions as I had experienced were too much, and in the glow of the moon, without the glare of the parching sun, my journey would have cost me less energy. Indeed, I now felt quite able to perform the ascent which had deterred me. Picking up my pack, I started for the...
Moi, toujours rien.
I have said that the unbroken monotony of the rolling plain was a source of vague horror to me. But I think my horror was greater when I gained the summit of the mound and looked down the other side into an immeasurable pit or canyon, whose black recesses the moon had not yet soared high enough. I felt myself on the edge of the world, peering over the rim into a fathomless chaos of eternal night. Through my terror ran curious reminiscences of Paradise Lost and of Satan's hideous climb through the unfashioned realms of darkness. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, I began to see that the slopes of the valley were not quite so.
Regarde dans la
Ledges
vie,
and
regarde en
outcroppings of
toi.
rock afforded fairly easy footholds for a descent, whilst after a drop of only a few hundred feet, the urged on by an impulse which I cannot definitely analyze, I scrambled with difficulty down the rocks and stood on the gentler slope beneath, gazing into the Stygian deeps, where no light had yet. All at once, my attention was captured by a vast and singular object on the opposite slope, which rose steeply about 100 yards ahead of an object that gleamed whitely in the newly bestowed.
Oh, mais c'est un carreau de chiottes, ça. Vous savez, les petits murets avec plein de carreaux, un peu vert, bleu, dégueulasse.
That it was merely a gigantic piece of stone, but I was conscious of a distinct impression that its contour and position were not altogether. A closer scrutiny filled me with sensations. For despite its enormous magnitude and its position in an abyss, I perceived beyond a doubt that the strange object was a Welsh whose massive bulk had known the workmanship and perhaps the worship. Dazed and frightened, yet not without a certain thrill of the scientist's or archaeologist's delight.
On n'est plus sur Terre.
The moon, now near the zenith, shone weirdly and vividly above the towering steeps that hemmed in the chasm, and revealed the fact that a far-flung body of water flowed at the bottom, winding out of sight in both directions, and almost lapping my feet as I stood. Across the chasm, the wavelets washed the base of the cyclone, on whose surface I could now trace both inscriptions and...
Ah, le monolithe a été fait par le cyclope.
The writing was in a system of hieroglyphics unknown to me and unlike anything I'd ever seen in books. consisting for the most part of conventionalized aquatic symbols such as fishes, eels, octopi, several characters obviously represented marine things which are unknown to the modern world, but whose decomposing forms I had observed on the ocean-risen plain. It was the pictorial carving, however, that did most hold me spellbound. Plainly visible across the intervening water, on account of their enormous size, were an array of bas-reliefs. I think that these things were supposed to depict men, at least a certain sort. Though the creatures were shown disporting like fishes in the waters of some marine grotto, or paying homage at some monolithic shrine which appeared to be under the waves. Of their faces and forms I dare not speak, for the mere remembrance makes me grow faint. Grotesque beyond the imagination of a Poe or a Bulwer. They were damnably human in general outline, despite webbed hands and feet, shockingly wide and glassy, bulging eyes, and other features less pleasant. Curiously enough, they seemed to have been chiseled badly out of proportion with their scenic background. For one of the creatures was shown in the act of killing a whale, represented as but little larger than himself. I remarked, as I say, their grotesqueness and strange size, but in a moment decided that they were merely the imaginary gods of some primitive fishing or seafaring.
Ah, mais c'est des Atlantes, hein.
Some tribe whose last descendant had perished eons before the first ancestor of the Piltdown or Neanderthal man was born. Awestruck at this unexpected glimpse into a past beyond the conception of the most daring anthropologist, I stood musing whilst the moon cast queer reflections on. Then, suddenly, I saw it. With only a slight churning to mark its rise to the surface, the thing slid into view above the dark waters. Loathsome, it darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith.
Ah, les drôles, mais...
About which it flung its gigantic scaly arms, while it bowed its hideous head and gave vent to certain measured sounds. I think I went mad then. Of my frantic ascent of the slope and cliff, and of my delirium.
Forest.
I believe I sang a great deal and laughed oddly when I was unable to sing. I have indistinct recollections of a great storm sometime after I reached them. At any rate, I know that I heard pearls of thunder and when I came out of the shadows, I was in a San Francisco hospital, brought thither by the captain of the American ship which had picked up my boat in mid-ocean. In my delirium, I had said much, but found that my words had been given scant attention. Of any land upheaval in the Pacific, my rescuers knew nothing. nor did I deem it necessary to insist upon a thing which I knew they could not believe.
On va s'arrêter là. Je vais peut-être lire ça avant. Parce que le jeu, il a pas l'air d'être trop long. J'ai pas envie de le faire d'une traite. Bon bah je vous dis à un prochain live sur Lovecraft, Dagon, qu'on fera sûrement demain, peut-être après-demain. Une petite vidéo courte, 25-30 minutes. Je vous dis à bientôt. Au revoir.